Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. It's an what we call in-betweener. So we had to come up with a topic, and I think we found a really good one because recently we were talking about what we should be doing for Volume 17. We might actually go to just regular numbered issues sometime because we found that a lot of people have issues with the Roman numerals. You think that that'd be easy enough for people who like ancient warfare, but we have to work with people in the logistics chain who may not be familiar with how to number 17, 18, and then of course we get to 19, and never mind.
Well, the funny thing, of course, is if we're going to be accurate, we need to have four eyes, but no one does four eyes. They always have.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. XVIII, or is it XI? Well, we can have long discussion. Anyway.
No, I've got an anecdote.
That's a matter for another couple of years, Murray. And the anecdote will have to wait until we have the virtual.
Oh no, it's a Porsche anecdote. It was very odd for me to have a Porsche anecdote. I was behind a Porsche 911, and they had a personalized plate, but clearly 911's gone, so they had 9JI. I'm like, that's not particularly witty. Why didn't you go IXII? Come on, man. But anyway, that's exactly what. No one knows their Roman numerals.
Anyway, okay. Where was I? Yeah, we wanted to discuss the themes because, as you, I'm sure, hopefully all know, Ancient Warfare Magazine is, the core of the magazine is shaped around a theme of, between 20 and 30 pages. We dedicate to a single topic, and we try to look at it from various different angles, so you don't get a bunch of articles that all basically say and then. We try to have sort of an introduction, maybe something analytical or more abstract, maybe a detail about a person or a unit or a weapon that's particularly involved. Obviously, core article is a battle or campaign, and so we try to give you some idea of what that theme is all about, because there's just no way we can give you everything the theme is all about. That's what we have books for, which is why there is always a further reading section in Ancient Warfare at the very back. Well, having now done, I think we're actually coming up 17.4. Is that issue the 100th? The
17.5. 17.5 is number 100.
17.5? That doesn't make sense.
Well, that's counting zero as one.
Oh yeah. That's now we're going to have to figure out, Murray, if we're actually computer people who count the first as zero or anyway. So 17.4, 75 is the 100th issue. So we've now done 91 issues, or 92 if you count the introductory volume, which you can download for free from the website if you can find it. Which means we've done a whole pile of different themes. But there are a lot of topics that we have not yet touched upon. Some of the biggest ones we're going to start on doing that later this year with Alexander the Great. And there are lots and lots of other ideas that we could still discuss. And there are some themes that we might want to look at again, maybe that we discussed in, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, or maybe just 5 years ago, but where we feel that either there are gaps, things that we missed that didn't work out, or maybe our ideas have changed and we could do it differently. So we put out a call on Facebook and Twitter and in a blog, and Angus, who the History Network, who records and edits all this, put out a call, and we have a whole long list of ideas and suggestions, which we will not be able to touch upon everything, because that will just be like yes, no, yes, no, maybe, which is boring. But we could discuss some ideas that we have and some things that have come up in those suggestions. And I should probably say that we want what a theme has to be able to do for us to work. It has to be sufficiently focused that you can feel like you have a decent chance of discussing that theme. It can't be so big that you basically need a book, or you feel like you're going to end up with, sort of introductions only, wiki type articles that just touch upon everything and don't do really anything. It also can't be too narrow and too small, because you very quickly are going to run into topics that we just aren't able to do because the sources aren't there. And of course, unfortunately, that goes for very many topics that the sources aren't there. We just don't know. If you're a fan of the podcast, you've heard us say that many, many times. We don't know the sources. And of course, because Ancient Warfare is an illustrated magazine, we have to be able to illustrate it. So if we have a topic that is extremely abstract or is, in an era or a geographical area where there's just no archaeology or there are no surviving locations or buildings or stuff like that, we're going to have a hard time making that an attractive issue. And, since we have to sell the damn thing, that is a consideration for us. So within those limits, anything goes as long as it's, in between, say, about 3000 BC to about AD 600. That is relevant. I mean, ancient is a period that you can discuss when it begins and when it ends. And any date you pick, any date range you pick is always artificial. But from the beginning, we decided that it should probably end somewhere between the fall of Rome, of the Roman Empire in the West, at least, and the coming of Islam, because it's just sort of handy. You can argue it should be much earlier. You can argue it should be much later. But for the benefits of our audience and Ancient Warfare, that's roughly where we're going to be at. That said, there's so many there are some really good ideas in these lists. There are also some really interesting ones. And there's some ideas that I would love to read about as well. But I think we're going to have great issues with trying to do them. Maria, do you have anything that you want?
Well, I think also the idea that we've got experts or people whose academic interests and writing styles suit with a particular period or theme. It's all very well saying we should be looking at the warfare of this, and you're like, who writes about that? And in some cases, that list is very short. When you combine that with there's no illustrations available, there's no X, there's no Y, there's no Z. You're like, oh, that becomes, as you say, an academic book with no color plates or photographs because there aren't any. And so I think all of those sorts of kismet things that need to come together are very tricky. And sometimes you get an author who's suggesting an article about a particularly obscure topic, but they have their own photographs, which, they took in the field, which oh, that's fantastic. And then you have the other issue, which is a much more technical one, which was, oh, these are Polaroids. We can't actually scan those Polaroids to a high enough quality to make the magazine actually look attractive. So, that kind of idea of pixel count and the size of the images and the high resolution of the images. I think we can, and we often have imagined a scenario that we then illustrate. We've just got one coming up at the moment for a unit in the Roman army of which we know nothing. And so we've kind of speculated and made an illustration of what we think maybe. And we can do that once per article, but you can't, here's a picture of a field that might have been the battlefield. We don't know. That's going to get.
It's actually my backyard.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to get dull very quickly. And yes, we can use maps and yes, we can use artwork, but often, the limitations of what you can add into an article that's already a challenge makes it almost an impossible, insurmountable field. And and also I think our lengths of articles. When you get someone who pitches an article that's going to be 10,000 words, you're like, well, no, our longest is 2,400 words. So can you get that into that?
Sometimes 3,000, but yeah,
we can stretch that. But it's that whole idea of can you express all of this in that word count? And I think that's also something that's a real skill and a real challenge for some, as we know, for some authors to get the word count down. Here you've got 1,800 words. You've sent me 6,000. How do I cut that down to 1,800 words?
But that's usually not that's not usually related to the theme. That's more a problem with certain people
who shall remain nameless on the podcast. Yes. So I think all of those, but all of that's in the mix about a particular theme and what elements go into it. And some of our themes, as we've found, are so wide ranging that you could redo the exact same theme and get an entirely different set of articles that still cover the same theme. So those are, to revisit, for instance, we're about to have the third part of the Rise of the Legion, and we haven't covered all of the Roman Legion issues in the previous two. So, that's a well you can keep going back to.
Yeah. Or another example of that is siege warfare, which we did twice now. We did issue 4.2 and what was it, 13.4 or something. Yeah, those topics you can come back to, and that's great.
And it also depends on what angle you're sort of taking on, on the one hand, writing the articles, but also on designing the theme, whether it's actually going from the idea that we mostly talk about here, going from a topic and then sort of going backwards from that, or on the other hand, and this is probably one area that we could do a bit more of, actually looking at starting with, say, the evidence and then moving forward from that in terms of what it tells us, working from, say, inscriptions and working from the actual artifact that we're going to use to illustrate, and then move into the article from that perspective. So again, it's we've got lots of perspectives that we can, you don't have to come at it from the one angle all the time.
No, and we shouldn't. We try to change it up all the time and keep it interesting that way for everyone involved, for ourselves and for the readers, more importantly. Maybe we should go through a few, because I do like looking at all these ideas. It does give me ideas too.
Which one of our lists?
I don't know. Just start with one. Naval warfare. I always like naval warfare.
There you go. Because we had such an outrageously big response to our question. What we had was sort of 4 blocks of things that we could do. So we have the replies to the blog that we put out, and why don't I say these, and we can pause on them and go, ooh, interesting.
Sure. Good idea.
That's where the naval warfare one had.
That was Twitter.
Right. Okay, we'll get to Twitter. So the blog replies was Martin Harvey Woodworth said, what about ancient dyes and paints used for clothing, uniform, shield decoration, dyeing leather? Surely reenactors, experimental archaeologists will have a wealth of knowledge to pass on. The challenges of campaigning was a popular one, David Smith and Michael Ward. Warriors of the Steppes, also popular, Peter Van Horen and David Lepage. The Sham Dynasty of China and the campaigns of Han, and perhaps pre-Alexandrian Indian warfare from Brian Vander Walker.
I like the Warriors of the Steppe theme. I wrote an article about actually the Persians, Darius going against the Scythians back in the early 6th century BC. That was one of the earliest articles I wrote for Ancient Warfare magazine. And I think that there's so much material there that can be mined. And I'm especially interested, in all of it, but especially in how did the Sasanians deal with the various Central Asian nomads on their northeastern frontier. I think that there's a lot of attention devoted to Roman Sasanian warfare of late antiquity, but not as much attention is given to how did the Sassanids deal with the Turks, the Hephthalites, various other Turkic raiders coming from the steppe, invading Iran. I think that would be certainly worthwhile to look at what was happening in the late 6th, early 7th centuries, and various victories, defeats, and ultimately victories over the coalitions. That I think should be explored.
Yeah, well, we did a steppe warfare issue. That was 8.3, I think. Is that the one that you had your article in?
I don't know. It was a long time ago. I want to say 2015.
8.3, yes, indeed. 8.3, Horsemen of the Steppes.
That is a topic, that would be interesting to do more of. But that's one where the illustrations might be difficult, because it's like location, steppe field.
What does a Hun look like? There's one, here's a coin from a culture we think is Hunnic-ish. and therefore this is what they might have looked like esque. And, what depictions are there of the Huns in Roman art? Oh, none, ever. So, that's one of these challenges that you're dealing with in that kind of warfare.
We should probably actually say that even if we say, hey, this as a theme, that's not going to work, this idea, there are still good ideas that we might try to look at in separate articles, because, as I said, 25, 30 pages for a theme, that still leaves as many pages for other articles.
I mean, something that jumps out at me then was actually Murray saying in terms of the images available. I mean, that in itself could be an interesting thing to look at in terms of the enemies of Rome, or in the case of the Persians or the Greeks, in terms of how they are depicting their enemies, and, comparing that to what we can know about what the archaeology tells us, what we have described in the sources and whatnot, just that cross comparison. And it's not our traditional battlefield approach, but it's still bringing out that aspect, which actually goes back to that one mentioned a minute ago about dyes and clothing. How does that actually transfer from, and, we come back to the Romans. I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, about the fact that you've always got that problem of who are the artists that depict the enemies? Are they, city-bound dwellers who haven't set foot on the battlefield and are using the vivid imagination, or what they've seen in the amphitheater being depicted very badly? Have they been to a triumph? Have they seen an enemy soldier brought back in chains?
Or are they just copying the already existing artwork?
Yeah. And it's a can of worms that basically opens up from that point.
Well, that's like, Dacian warfare, for instance. The best visual representation of the Dacians in the ancient world surviving is Trajan's column and other monuments of Trajan, even to the point that they're reused by Constantine. But they're not Dacian representations of themselves. They're Roman representations of the Dacians. So you've got that issue. And in the color, I think, that's what Jasper was saying, an article on dyeing and colors, or even a series of articles about dyeing and colors, because the reenactor understanding and the natural dyes movement of what products are available to make this product. And interesting insight, the Romans did not know about beetroot. They had beetroot, but they ate the leaves. They didn't actually eat the bulb of a beetroot. And they didn't realize, I thought about this the other day when, the Murex shell is extincted, is that a word? By the Romans, by the ancients. They didn't realize that just under their feet was the beetroot that could quite easily have provided their purple for them. But anyway, sorry. The other thing about that, of course, is that you get articles that you can explore, but that kind of thinking, as opposed to the traces of polychromy on surviving sculpture, which, we've got snatches of in the Alexander sarcophagus, for instance, and a few terracotta statuettes that have survived with paint on them, and a few other sort of tombs and things like that. Those are, in a way, divergent threads of the same cloth, because they're a sort of a different picture. Because is the color of a Roman statue in its original state meant to be an accurate depiction, or is it meant to be a vibrant, bright, artistic depiction that doesn't necessarily reflect the real world? That's all around the same area, but not necessarily going to come in the same article, for instance. Sure, I'll continue my list. Any others that got through that? The armies and conflicts of the 3rd to 10th centuries in Europe, the British Isles, North Africa, and the Middle East, which I think is a kind of a late Roman, the Franks, the Ottonians, Germanic steppes and Muslim armies. Again, I think one of the things with that is that in some cases there's lots of illustration material, and in others there's much less.
I mean, and we've done quite a bit of that. I mean, the latest issue, of course, we had the Saxon shore forts and everything involved with that last year, and we did Germanic invasions a couple of years ago. And you very quickly run into, and the problem is that we always have with this stuff is that, the narrative sources are all Roman.
And I think the other thing, of course, is that if you've done it recently and you've used all the photographic material available, if you revisit that theme too soon, the same photos will show up. And you're like, oh, yeah, no, that's that same photo which you've used before, which is a poor old nightmare for people involved. Right. So we've got articles on early Muslim armies, which is I think one of those flips between, is it late Rome, late ancient, or is it early medieval? Articles on the conflicts between the migrating different Germanic steppes nations. Articles on dress, flags, weapon, armor, and shields. Types of fortifications. Siege techniques. Here we go. Jasper. Pre-Greco-Roman naval warship design and naval warfare. Egyptian, Indian, and Mycenaean. And then track the life of a history of a Roman legion from establishment to disbandment.
That is one I would say does appeal, I've got to say.
Yeah, but I think that's logically a series of articles, not a theme to me.
I think depending on the legion you pick, you could have a theme, but it could also be, because you could, who were they fighting? That also comes into that particular theme about that particular, or what campaigns was that legion involved in? And in some cases, if you go through the history of the 30-odd legions of the Roman Empire, some of those don't even get mentioned.
If there's a few that you could do it probably with, yeah.
It takes it back to the sort of more of the old style idea of focusing on the individual. That I know it's not trendy these days in terms of history to
we don't care about
dwell on the individual. No, but I would say go back to the individual, pick the characteristic type, like I think in volume 5.1, I think it was, there was the focus on Marius, and of course, so it went through the articles in that edition. One was on the new man in Roman society. You had the idea of the development of the pilum, and was there a breaking pin or not? You then had the invasions from the north and the barbarians. You can go off on those tangents from one individual, or in this case, one legion as such. I think it is a
one of the other amazing things about the magazine and its longevity is that the academic position on Marius, for instance, from 5.1, which was 2012, 10 years ago, has actually shifted in the last decade. There's been, we saw in the Rise of the Roman Legion 2 last year that the idea now that there's a Marian reform is kind of now being challenged. And was it not just part of a process, and in fact is not attributable to one individual? And that's something that modern academics have done. They pinned it on Marius when it really probably wasn't Marius. There are several things that Marius is credited with which clearly occurred before him, and there are things that we credit with Marius that really don't seem to come in until later in the century, the first century BC. So that shift in the zeitgeist of it is a really interesting reason to revisit a theme.
For example, in a recent article on a pilum, hopefully it came through.
Who was that again?
I don't know. I hope that it came through that something along the lines of actually the idea of the broken pin, or the breaking pin, or the wooden peg is actually seems to be really being ousted these days in favor of the idea that actually if you lodge a pilum in in a shield, and you then try to wrench it out of the thing, it does bend. It doesn't matter about a pin in it. I think there's that acceptance these days. And again, that's just one issue, that it's totally gone the other way compared to 10 years ago.
Yeah. And I think also when you have a single piece of evidence that gets turned into a trend or a thing, and you're like, no, this is a isolated event specific expedient tactic, not it was the old flaming pigs argument, which you used to get in Roman, wargaming, and you're like, what? Where's this flaming pig coming from? And it's a single anecdote about a pig being burnt, and suddenly they're like a unit, and you're like, what? So, and I think that's one of those sort of, you could do something on the myths and misnomers of ancient warfare, which would be, all sorts of things like that.
To build upon your idea of using individuals as springboards for a theme or articles, I was thinking that the role of the general, the non-aristocratic general in the imperial period. So, for example, Marcus Agrippa, Corbulo, Agricola. None of those generals were emperors, but they had intimate relations, with emperors in the sense that they worked for emperors directly. I think that would be interesting to explore what maybe their biographies were like, what were their battles, how did they, and their relations with the emperors that they served, because some of them were very close. Marcus Agrippa and Augustus. Others, such as Agricola and Domitian, I think not so much. So that certainly worthwhile exploring what that was like for those emperors in the imperial period.
Those individuals you mentioned actually they could sort of have springboard themselves off into infrastructure that they were involved in developing and building, aiding the military cause. In terms, I'm thinking Agrippa in terms of his European road system, and in terms of Septimius Severus, in terms of the grain distribution in northern Britain. It's those aspects that bring in little articles along the way.
And of course, Agricola, issue 1-1, Corbulo. We've had Corbulo several articles. Agrippa, have we had specific about Agrippa?
Not an edition, but an article we have, I think, thanks to Lindsay, I think.
That would be not strange, yeah. And of course, Murray did a whole series of articles about how to be a general, which is a lot of it was based on imperial era.
Yeah, it's fascinating, though, because, again, those things you say, you can re-explore it or explore it from a different angle, and as trends change. And it's funny because there will come a point where re-exploring the individual will become new again. You're like, wow, what a revolutionary approach to explore the great individual in Roman warfare or Greek warfare. And you're like, no, this
we've been doing that for years.
This is a really old approach that we're just doing again because it went out of fashion for such a long time. And I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Because I love the word that we use for some of our themes, which is that they should be diachronic, and that you want to look at a field or an area of warfare rather than a historical period or an individual. So that like siege warfare or
naval warfare,
naval warfare. So that
battle
idea
tactics, geography and war, reconnaissance, which I saw.
I was about to say that about geography in terms of instead of the individual, bring in the location. As such, there are so many locations that they feature again and again and again in military warfare in the ancient period that you can pick one. You just have to. The most obvious to me would be the Forum of Rome, and saying that is so instrumental in terms of, yes, you can go back to the legendary battle of Romulus and Titus Tatius, but on the other hand, you can go to it being the Augustus and Marcus Aurelius throwing their spears to declare war at the Temple of Peace. It's that instrumental in different ways as a location, not necessarily always as a battle site itself, but it has knock-on effect.
Well, of course, you got the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 or 386, depending on which view you take. There's a final battle in the actual forum after the woe to the vanquished moment, depending on the source. Yeah, all of those are ways. I mean, my favorite phrase of Plutarch's is the dancing floor of war to refer to the battlefields of Boeotia. It's just a very cool kind of like, join me for a dance. Of course, we'll meet here at Plataea, which I think is fascinating. Yes. The foxtrot at Delium, of course. So, all of those sorts of ideas are fabulous. Right, we're only in our first group of themes. Right.
Yeah, we're not getting anywhere very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. Alexander is something that's been mentioned as well, which, of course, is something that's coming up in 1606 at the end of this year. So
did we do the one before that? Evidence for
not.
Fighting style of Britons?
No, so the evidence of fighting style for the Britons outside of the southeast, the Brigantes, the Caledonians of the era of Agricola, and then the Caledonians and the Metai who fought against Severus, or the Picts of AD 367. I think that's an article, but again, the illustration possibilities there are tricky. Which brings us to Facebook. The responses on Facebook. We've got warriors of the ancient Arab and North African tribes and kingdoms would be interesting. Douglas Baldwin said, loving the late Roman articles. Thank you, Douglas. Sebastian Gudemeyer warfare in India during the times of Alexander the Great and after, warfare of the ancient Balkans, Thracians, Illyrians, Epirites and things. A what-if series would be interesting. For example, Caesar's Dacian and Parthian campaigns, or if Alexander the Great didn't die so young. In fact, one of our panel wrote an article about what if Alexander had turned on Italy, as was suggested, and Livy explored that as a what would have happened if Alexander had come to Italy. And of course, being Livy, it's like, well, Rome would have beaten him.
Just to follow up on that question, I don't know of any other example in ancient literature where it asks that kind of what if question. Is anyone else familiar with that off the top of their heads? Because to me, Livy is unique.
I can't think of any.
You've got that the supposed discussion between Scipio and Hannibal, and the what if.
But who's the best general?
Yeah, and then with the ending of what if you would have beaten me, sort of thing. It doesn't really go as far in terms of theorizing, but
that kind of article is also, it is, we ask our readers for feedback all the time because we're needy. Fortunately, it's usually very nice what you guys say about what we do. And I find that what if articles are a bit marmite, as you might say in the UK. Some people love to read about them and think about those ideas, and other people are like, no, can't do that.
They're counterfactuals. That is, yeah. My idea has always been isn't so much, I mean, this is the way it would have gone, because how can you know that? But to try to understand the two different forces that would have been at odds.
Sure, yeah.
So, for example, at the time, and maybe come to a different understanding of what made each, special or unique by comparing their strengths and weaknesses. So that maybe is,
I think,
obviously.
Yeah. There's also an aspect of what if in several battles where the sources are so contradictory about what the course of a particular battle.
Yeah.
I've just been looking at the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander the Great, and you're like, well, if you follow Arrian and Plutarch, it's a headlong rush into the river late at night, with no support. Whereas if it's Diodorus, it's a crossing of the river the following morning, and you're like, oh, hang on a minute, those. So in a way, they are what happened, what really happened, and the first answer is we don't know. And then from there, you're like, but this source tells us this, and this source tells us that. So in a way, you're doing a what if, trying to work through the problems of your sources and go, maybe this way, because what they said makes no sense. But, why did they say it then? And I think when you start to think about several ancient battles, you get a list of like, well, this battle, because we have these two contradictory versions, this battle, these two, this, So that's a sort of an aspect of it.
At least you have the outcome, though, usually.
Yeah, but then you've got that issue that we were talking about before, that you're actually looking at the same thing as been looked at, these battles, for instance, but you're looking at them from a different lens and a different way of exploring, for instance, the Battle of Granicus for Alexander. So that's certainly something that's possible. Right, moving through an issue about Sargon of Akkad and the rise of the First World Empire, a comparison of the strategies and differences between the Semites and the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, maybe Septimius Severus's campaign in North Africa, or the Battle of Herchon.
That would be an interesting thing to do. Sargon of Akkad, that would be interesting, I think, but I'm not sure you could do a whole thing. I would be very worried about pictures.
There's some very nice pictures of Sargon, but they run out quite quickly.
Yeah, of him, but then
yeah, exactly.
You also don't get as many, how can I say, peripheral issues that you can sort of have articles going off on. In terms of it's mostly sort of following the narrative of the campaigns that we hear about, but you're sort of talking about it from a very big perspective.
I kicked this city-state into submission, and then that one. Strategies and tactics, but maybe we're underestimating. Maybe we need to look into it. But the really early history of that Mesopotamia is very interesting, but requires very specialist work.
Okay, we're into Twitter responses now. Robert Sheridan, why, with the outcry regarding Netflix's Cleopatra documentary, how about something addressing revisionist history now and in the past? Do we want to do a controversies?
No.
how very uncontroversial. Celtic
No,
culture.
no, I
Celtic-
just, it's because you get into very criticism of current media, and that's just not what we do. I mean, we could do sort of maybe you could do a parallel thing about Caesar in Egypt and late Ptolemaic armies if you're able to reconstruct them, which is really hard. That might be interesting. You could do that, but I don't think we should get into, we like our issues to be interesting and worthwhile in 10 years and without having seen that series.
I think it's also one of the things that we, without trying to invite criticism or controversy, sometimes you wade into it, not realizing it, whether it be the question of modern identities with ancient peoples, he says, being very, very non-specific, and you suddenly find that you've invited a controversial issue when you were never trying to, which is, that fraught enough as it is, as opposed to actually creating an issue to actually invite those sorts of criticisms.
I think they certainly inspire articles, I think, at times, but I don't think we need to sort of draw the media in at the same time. I can think we can, take that issue of the Cleopatra idea and say, right, we can look at nationalities of within the armies and origins and how influential is the Macedonian aristocratic clique over within the military structure, that sort of thing. But we don't need to bring it into the media aspect.
Yeah, but the revisionist history is basically, that's called historiography, the history of a particular subject. I mean, when we look at the rise of Greek warfare, which we've had an issue on just recently, that's changed, to the point now we don't like talking. It used to be orthodoxy and heresy with the, automatic associations that the heretical view is the wrong one. Now there's the new view and the older view when they don't like using orthodoxy and heresy anymore. And the sort of ever-evolving idea about how that warfare evolved, and Roman warfare is the same, and therefore the sort of evolution of thought. And then there's always a return and a cyclical kind of idea that what was once the commonly held view falls out of popularity and then comes back. So, you've got that in the rise of the hoplite, you've got that in the development of the Roman legion. So those, in a way, those are revisionist histories being explored, but through the much less controversial historiographical lens, shall we say. Right. Celtic culture, Celtic warriors, and leading of druids, druid leadership.
Well, we've done an issue on that, 5, 6, I want to say. It's very possibly something that we could come back to.
And expanding it into religion as a whole in terms of the ancient world.
Maybe
the influence of religion
together with
warfare.
Ancient History Magazine, our sister magazine.
So then we've got Irish warfare in the early medieval period. That may in fact be something for medieval world culture and conflict to look at. As an infantryman, I hate to say this, thank you, Harrison, but I would love an issue on ancient marines, particularly how the hoplite was conditioned to fight at sea, as well as an expeditionary warfare. It would be very interesting and relatively unexplored. One for you, Jasper. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would find it interesting too, but I'm pretty sure their sources would just not supply us with that information other than, hoplite was conditioned in the way hoplite was conditioned. And good luck, now you're at sea.
My stance too with the Roman period is that Roman Marines were really just legionaries on boats. So and then asked to go across the Corvus or something like that. So I don't think that they were a specialized corps.
One of my very few official academic contributions I've written was on Roman Marines in the first century AD. And I think that there may have been specialist Marines at that time, but that's just from teasing out epigraphical evidence. And there's very little to say about how they trained or how they were trained, other than that they may have been more familiar with fighting at sea or being at sea than, Joe Blow the legionary.
There is, of course, that controversial inscription, Hurarus, but I don't know that that's actually a real inscription at all. Anyway, lovely jubbly. And getting back to it, that was a fabulous marine pun. Those are hard to do. I'd love to see an issue dedicated to the Sasanians by Sean. Thank you, Sean. I think we've just looked at a couple of Sasanian.
Yeah, and we had a dedicated issue, but again, a long time ago.
Yeah. Yes. The Justinian's
Also, Volume
Fireman.
5. Volume 5 seems to have been a good one because it comes by every time this year, this time around.
12 years ago, completely, it's time again. The collapse of the Western Roman professional army from 388 to the early 5th century from Kenneth. That's certainly something that can be explored, but again, much less illustratable. You know, you'll generally always get, here's a page from the Notitia Dignitatum. Here's another page from the Notitia Dignitatum. Here's an artwork based on a page from the Notitia Dignitatum, which of course in itself is a controversial subject. The Notitia, you could actually have a theme on the Notitia.
And is the collapse of the Western Roman professional army, or is it really the collapse of the Western Roman state and the army just goes with it? Or I don't know.
Nice. Oh, lovely. Well, Agathias, of course, blames Justinian for that, for reducing the actual size of the Roman army, which is one of the very few snippets of it used to be. And you're like, what does that mean? What are we talking about? What year are we talking about? What used to be? That there were 600,000 in the Roman army and it had shrunk to 150,000 by the time he's writing. And he blames that on Justinian, which is fascinating in itself. Right, where are we at? Cyrus the Great and his many, many conquests. How is an army moving in unknown countries and territories? I remember this is from user von Clausewitz. I remember reading a story about the young Alexander moving with an army through Thrace before his conquest in the east, and I was always wondering the difficulties to understand that. There's several examples of that, people getting lost in unfamiliar territory, and, how they negotiated it.
Yeah, we haven't done very much about reconnaissance, I think. And I mean, it's a hard topic.
Yeah, a couple of articles on exploratores and speculatores.
But that is about it, I think.
I thought there was some mention of logistics in Alexander's campaigns at some point. I don't know if that was just mentioning it on the podcast.
Well, we had a logistics issue, but that probably, I would say that reconnaissance is not logistics.
Okay, reconnaissance. Okay,
yeah, but hard.
Yeah. Hard's never stopped us. Naval warfare. I mean, yeah, there's from Rana.
Well, we've had several issues. I'm sure there'll be more.
I don't know if this has been covered for Alexander's campaigns in what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia. That's look for 1606 coming up. Palmyra and Aurelian, we did most recently. When was Palmyra?
The breakaway empires of the 3rd century.
Yeah. And then last one in this list is gladiators, ?
They have come by on occasion. Gladiators are one of those topics where we always discuss, is that military? Is it just something else?
Yeah. It's almost as you say, it's almost an ancient history issue where
that you have at the Battle of Bedriacum, and you also have during the Hannibal campaigns, gladiators actually being utilized in emergency situations. I don't know if there's enough
Marius
to really explore.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius as well. Normally emergency measures, I think.
And not very successful.
Well, yeah, but Marius is supposed to have used gladiators to train his soldiers, isn't he?
Yeah.
Well,
but again, is that something that's given to Marius that actually predates Marius? And again, that comes back to the Marian reforms. So,
well, of course, the idea that the Manica of the Dacian Wars seen on the Adam Clissi monument, coming from the gladiatorial knowledge of protecting
against big choppy things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. We've got to the end of our massive contributions from Twitter, Facebook, and the blog responses. Thank you, everybody.
There was some other ones, actually.
There were, I think, in the Google Doc that Angus prepared.
Yeah, because we had some patrons too. Rome Total War flashbacks. I like Rome Total War. And we've said we should do an episode maybe just where we play Rome Total War against each other. I'm not sure you could do a theme on that.
Battle reports.
More articles on the military history of China, Southeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent would be interesting. Yes, I agree.
I've commissioned a couple, so watch this space. So we've got a couple of experts who want to write articles on that. We're at their mercy, really. So
Yeah,
you know,
we have to find people who can do it.
and then, you know, and even the museums and things are much less accessible to our photographic sources than others. So those are other sort of considerations for that.
Michael Primerano on Patreon, who suggests payouts, treatment, care, respect, rewards, and reuse of military veterans throughout ancient history. We have had articles on that, veteran colonies, evocati,
Silver shields,
medals,
as well.
and rewards. Yeah, there's stuff you could do with that. I'm sure we can probably find something where a battle where evocati played a big role, because our themes have to have a battle in them.
Yeah, and I mean the rewards, you know, again, that sort of sounds more like a series of articles as opposed to a theme. But is that not a theme? Not sure. You know, I think one of the other issues with a lot of those is that they are quite diachronic. You know, the idea of military rewards beginning with the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, and going all the way through to, you know, maybe Belisarius, the last man to celebrate a triumph in Constantinople. You know, those sorts of, you know,
well, that's not necessarily a problem. I would say that the difference between a theme has a certain internal coherence, and you can have different articles with looking at really different aspects of the same thing. You know, you look at as I said, maybe a soldier of a specific unit, a battles or an event. Look at some sources, and it all gives you a complete picture. And a series could be more of a slightly more repetitive nature, where you look at something similar and you come back to it, which if you stick them all together, it might make for a slightly boring issue. But if you change it up and space them a bit, it could be interesting to look at things. We have a lot of issues and ideas to think about, and I think we certainly talked a lot. So I think we'll stop at that. And you sort of got an impromptu editorial meeting to listen in on today. I hope that was interesting. I'm afraid we didn't make any decisions about the themes for next year, but we will do that soon. And in the meantime, see you again soon. Bye.